The serial killer Donato Bilancia has many names. He preferred to call himself Walter, while journalists created a whole collection of nicknames for him. The Ligurian monster, the prostitute hunter, the train killer are just a few of them. Whoever talks about him never fails to emphasize that he was Italy's most prolific serial killer. 17 victims in just 6 months, with only a couple of days between some of his crimes. They say he lived 3 lives. He himself claims there were 2 people inside him. He underwent 13 psychiatric evaluations and was sentenced to 13 life terms. Of all the serial killers I know, he seems to me the most unusual, and perhaps after watching this video you'll agree with me. Once upon a time, in Italy. Donato Bilancia was born in 1951 in Italy's poorest region, Basilicata. His childhood was perfect for a future serial killer. Little Donato suffered one psychological trauma after another. He was weak, short in stature, and bad at football, so he had nothing to gain popularity among his peers. His parents, whom he considered so stupid that the brains of both could easily fit into a confetti circle, constantly argued. When Donato was still a toddler, the family moved north to Genoa, where people lived richer and more comfortably, but migrants from the south were not favored, so the boy became an outcast among his peers. Apparently due to stress, he wet the bed for a long time. To combat the problem, his mother found nothing better than to humiliate the boy. Every time she hung out the wet mattress to dry, she loudly announced that it had happened again, so the neighbors and Donato's classmates were aware. His father didn't behave much better. Due to asthma, the boy took hormonal medications, and apparently for this reason, his penis was underdeveloped. The wise father made fun of this in every way, and once, in the presence of 3 cousins, pulled down his underwear. The boy cried, tried to break free, to hide. He would remember this humiliation for the rest of his life and would suffer from feelings of powerlessness, resentment, and loneliness all his life. He dropped out of school without finishing. He tried to find himself in honest work, trying out the trades of baker, auto mechanic, and bartender by the age of 16. But, in his own words, theft turned out to be his true calling. He started as usual with petty crimes, bicycles, and mopeds. Then, stealing a truck with Christmas panettone cakes and a stupid attempt to sell them right on the spot near the supermarket. His first imprisonment was in 1972. In prison, Donato goes through a school of mastery with a professional thief, and comes out of freedom as a qualified burglar who can open any lock. Now all his thefts are carefully worked out and planned in several variants, and the loot is enough for a more than luxurious life. Genoa is a port city with all the ensuing consequences. At that time it was full of illegal gambling houses, and there were enough legal ones too. Nearby are Sanremo, Menton, and even Monte Carlo with their casinos. Donato, or rather Walter, as Bilancia, who hated his real name, always introduced himself, becomes an avid player. Roulette, cards, dice, Walter is very passionate. He plays big. A bet of 40 million lire is common. A win of 200 million is also. As, however, is a loss. He always pays his card debts, so he has to steal often and in large amounts. At first he works with accomplices, but once a random partner turns him in, and after serving 2 years he comes out of prison with a firmly learned lesson. Always work alone. And not only work, but also live. All his life, Donato Bilancia was lonely, although he sought closeness all his life. He had a girlfriend. Either he left her because of his complexes, or she left him, because of the same. The fact is, they broke up, and this was the only case of a serious relationship with a woman in his life. Of all the family, he was close only with his older brother Michel. But in 1987, on the day when Michel's wife finalized their divorce and won custody of their 4-year-old son, he took that very son in his arms and threw himself under a train with him. Donato was invited to identify the bodies. They say that since then he has been afraid of blood, and from that day he hated trains. And women. Maybe so, but for now this hatred doesn't manifest in anything but an acute sense of loneliness. In 1990 he gets into a serious accident, spends several days in a coma with a head injury. But even after this, he doesn't show any bloodthirsty inclinations. Everyone who knew Walter personally unanimously affirms. He was never aggressive, not even simply confrontational. He loved animals, and animals loved him. Elegant, with excellent manners, the life of the party, In the casino they adored him. A gambler, he always paid his debts, and also constantly treated everyone, acquaintances and strangers, to dinner and drinks. He himself understood that in this way he was trying to buy people's sympathy, but it suited him. He was used to paying for love. And it's quite possible that his whole life would have gone on like this, but in 1997, when Bilancia was already 47, an event occurred which, in his own words, turned him into a serial killer. This event was betrayal. A friend, Maurizio Parenti, co-founder of an underground casino, lured Walter into a game, and in collusion with his partner Giorgio Centenaro, they tricked him into losing a very large sum, and Bilancia accidentally overheard their conversation in the bathroom about how successfully they had fleeced another simpleton. Later, Donato recounted, hearing how the one he considered his closest friend called him a chicken for plucking, he lost his speech. His head seemed to be encircled by a red-hot hoop, and a patatrack happened in it. After crying all night from resentment, Bilancia decided these two must die. Centenaro was first. Under the pretext of playing, Walter visited him at home. Threatening with a Smith & Wesson revolver, he forces him to undress to his underwear, tapes him to a chair with duct tape, telling him in the process why this is punishment. He closes the mouth of the immobilized prisoner with one hand, pinches his nose with the fingers of the other, and when he stops struggling, checks if he's really dead by kicking him in the groin. Then he removed the tape and left, not even taking the $1,500 lying on the table. Finding that nothing was missing, the police concluded that the death was natural. The pathologist concluded that the deceased had a heart attack, so no one simply bothered to look for criminal evidence. No criminal case was opened, and journalists paid no attention to the incident. Such silence did not suit Walter. He even called the police with an anonymous message that Centenaro did not die of natural causes, but this call had no effect, either because of this or for some other reasons. But strangulation as a method of murder did not appeal to Walter. He shot all his other victims with a revolver. The next was the second deceiver, best friend Maurizio Parenti, with his young wife Carla Scotto. Visiting them, Bilancia also tied both with tape, explained why he was doing this, and killed them. Him, with a shot to the head, her, to the chest. He had to shoot the woman twice. After the first shot she didn't die, and Walter finished her off so she wouldn't suffer. He later regretted killing Carla. He said she didn't deserve such a death, but he couldn't leave a witness. Since Parenti was the cashier of a gambling establishment belonging to the Genoese mafia, these two deaths were attributed to gangster showdowns. Well, and Walter. Taking about 30 million lire in jewelry for a large sum from Parenti, he realized three things. First, killing is easy. Second, you can earn money from this. And the main thing, he likes it. And just 3 days later, he went on his next business. Disguised as a postman, Bilancia rang the doorbell of an elderly couple of jewelers and said he had brought a registered letter for signature. They invited him into the living room, sat him on the sofa, and even wanted to give him a tip. Then he took out his Smith & Wesson and demanded the key to the safe. The signora began to shout to the housekeeper to call the police, but the frightened woman instead hid on the balcony. Walter got angry. He always got angry when he thought someone was trying to deceive him. He shot the hostess in the chest, her husband, who tried to crawl into another room to get to his own gun, in the back, and, either out of forgetfulness or under impression, left without taking anything. So he realized that he loves killing even more than money. Then there was a pause, a whole 17 days. And on November 13th, Bilancia killed the currency dealer Luciano Maro, taking 45 million lire from him. He arrived at the crime scene in a newly purchased black Mercedes, to which he would be tenderly attached, and because of which he would later get caught. Again a break of 2.5 months, and then the security guard Giangiorgio Canu. Walter, a former burglar, naturally didn't have warm feelings for guards, especially after one of them wounded him with a service weapon during a robbery. But this guard was particularly unlucky. He also happened to look externally similar to Giorgio Centenaro, who had so annoyed Bilancia. And on top of that, Canu's car had the number 32, which Donato considered lucky for himself. Here he took another step towards developing his signature. He forced Canu to put a jacket over his head. It's hard to believe, but the newly minted serial killer was afraid of blood, ever since he had to identify his brother and nephew who died on the rails. So Donato Bilancia didn't like blood, and didn't torture his victims. He didn't even want to watch them die. It seems that all he needed was to feel power. His bliss consisted in the fact that he could decide who lives and who dies. And he decided that now prostitutes should die, preferably foreign ones. The first was an Albanian, Stella Truja, real name Almarina Bodegani. Walter was her regular client, so she fearlessly got into his car and went where he wanted, to the seashore near his parents' house. There, after quick sex, he offered her to get out of the car and look at the sea, and then threw a towel over the girl's head and shot. This happened on March 9, 1998, and on March 18 it was the turn of Ukrainian Lyudmila Zubskova. Different nationality, different hair color, different suit in general. The scenario is almost the same. Offered a large sum, brought to the sea, quickly had sex, made her get out of the car and kneel. Then, a jacket on the head and a shot to the back of the head. Lyudmila's relatives refused to take her body. It lay in the morgue for 3 months, until a parish priest collected money from people for the funeral. Then Bilancia took a short break in working with ladies. He needed money, and he found another currency dealer, Enzo Gorni. He entered his exchange office and demanded he hand over the proceeds. Gorni first tried to lie that there was only one safe in the premises, then to reach for a gun. As already mentioned, Bilancia really didn't like when someone tried to outsmart him. In anger, he emptied the entire cylinder into the money changer. 5 bullets hit the target, 1 hit the chest and 4 the head. The fleeing criminal was seen by the deceased's brother. He helped compose his photo fit. However, not the first one. Walter had been seen and described more than once. But he's lucky, and besides this photo fit, the police have no leads. They don't even know yet that the same gun is involved in the recent high-profile cases in Liguria. Speaking of luck, Walter took the money stolen from Gorni's exchange office to the casino in San Remo that same evening. At the very last moment, when they had already stopped accepting bets, he threw chips on the table and hit the jackpot. The next day, under his own name, he calmly went to the bank and exchanged francs for lire using his real passport. And just 3 days later, he returned to his favorite business, killing prostitutes. Only this time, there was a misfire. Either Donato had exhausted his weekly luck limit, or fortune favored his victim more. The Latin American Lorena, real name Julia Castro, seems to have been born under a lucky star. From birth, Lorena was a boy, but then changed gender. When Bilancia took her to a deserted place outside the city and stopped the car so that it was impossible for the passenger to open the door, Lorena became wary. She tried to calm the suspicious client, negotiate with him, seduce him finally. Nothing worked, as it didn't work to get a pepper spray out of her bag. And then, by some incredible chance, a private security car pulled up to them. Now it was Donato's turn to negotiate with danger, but Lorena disrupted the negotiations, shouting at the top of her lungs that her client had a gun and was crazy. This didn't help the guards. Bilancia shot both, but while he was doing this, Lorena got out of the car and ran. He chased after her and caught up. They fell. Lorena fought desperately, but he still overpowered her, sitting on top, put the gun to her head. Misfire. The cylinder ran out of bullets. Lorena gets a blow to the head and pretends to be dead. Bilancia goes to the car, reloads the weapon, finishes off the agonizing guards, and again returns to Lorena. She hears approaching footsteps, lets him come close, and grabbing him by the legs, knocks him to the ground. A new round of wrestling on the ground ended with Lorena getting a bullet in the stomach. She didn't feel pain, only how her clothes got wet with something hot. 3 more blows with the gun handle to the head, and finally, being sure that she was no longer breathing, he leaves her, gets into his black Mercedes and drives away. The wounded Lorena crawls to the guard's car, and through their communication device reports what happened. They didn't even believe her at first. The story seemed too incredible, but they still sent help, and the girl was saved. So the police got another photo fit, a description of the maniac's car and its numbers, but Bilancia didn't even think about stopping. 5 days later he went hunting again, the victim of which was a black prostitute from Nigeria, Tessie Adodo. And 5 days later he decided, apparently for variety, to visit not a foreigner but an Italian woman providing intimate services not on the street but at home. The honor fell to Luisa Cimignello. Bilancia came to her as usual, checked the escape routes and took out his gun. And Luisa took out a portrait of her nephew, and lying that it was her son and that he had no father, began to beg the client not to leave the child a complete orphan. Donato Bilancia loved children very much. He apologized, left, and never appeared on Luisa's horizon again, only called the next day to ask not to report to the police. As he later recounted, he seemed to see himself in this photograph. He said that he wanted to kill a prostitute, but it turned out as if she killed him. He said that he would never harm a child, but by a cruel irony of fate he did this just 9 days later, albeit unknowingly. April 12, 1998 fell on Easter. Young nurse Elisabetta Zoppetti, working in an oncology clinic in Milan, agreed to substitute for a colleague for the night shift. At that moment she was vacationing with her family in Liguria, so immediately after the holiday dinner, she had to leave her upset husband and crying daughter and go to the station. To please his beloved wife, her husband bought her a ticket in a first-class carriage. If only he knew that it was in this carriage, practically empty on a holiday, that Donato Bilancia would look for his new victim. He waited until the woman went to the bathroom, opened the door with a pre-prepared key that he had with him, threw her own jacket over her head and shot her. He took the ticket from her purse so as not to travel as a stowaway, and got off the train. Bilancia regretted this crime. He didn't think that a woman on a train on Easter Day might have children. Then, just 2 days later, there was another street prostitute, Macedonian Cristina Valla, and although there were suspicions before that it was about mafia showdowns, now, since the same weapon was used in all cases, it becomes clear to everyone. We're talking about a lone wolf, for whom the most suitable name is the Ligurian monster. A wide profile, many names. Killer of prostitutes, guards, currency dealers. 4 days after Cristina, on April 18th, he became a train killer. Again, an ordinary young woman was unlucky, the babysitter Maria Angela Rubino. The same scheme, toilet, jacket on the head, shot. But then, to demonstrate his contempt for women, Bilancia decided to liven up the ritual by masturbating over the body. This livened up the investigation as well. Now the police had the monster's biological material for DNA testing. However, they still didn't have the monster himself on their horizon, but the shots from his gun were heard with frightening frequency. Just 2 days later, on April 20th, he killed the gas station attendant Giuseppe Mileto for refusing to give him gas on credit. Walter became enraged and put 5 bullets in the head of the unfortunate man who dared to contradict him. This ends the list of victims of the Ligurian monster. Surprisingly, the avid player, accustomed to living lavishly and treating everyone, was caught because of trying to save money. Donato Bilancia didn't like to pay for toll roads. He would tailgate another car and thus slip through the barrier. Usually this resulted in a fine, but it came in the name of the car owner Pino Monello. Bilancia, when buying the Mercedes, paid only part of the sum and remained indebted to the seller, so the car was registered to the previous owner, and the new one drove with the owner's permission. After receiving fines for a considerable amount, Monello thought that perhaps this wasn't such a good decision. And then he noticed that the payment points for which violation notices were coming strangely coincided with places where murders occurred at the same time. Realizing that fines were probably not his biggest problem now, he rushed to a lawyer, and arm in arm with him, to the police. Where it was discovered that, in addition to the coincidence of the car brand, the buyer's face quite fit the photo fit of the maniac. On the instructions of the investigators, Monello arranged meetings with Bilancia in a bar, allegedly about completing the deal. The main result of these meetings was a coffee cup and a cigarette butt from the alleged monster. The genetic expert worked around the clock to compare the samples as quickly as possible, and did get confirmation. Donato Bilancia's DNA fully matched that extracted from the material collected on the body of Maria Angela Rubino. Though not knowing about this, Walter was nervous. He imagined shadows pursuing him. He was preparing to flee and had already packed a bag. He didn't make it. He was arrested on May 6th when he was leaving the hospital after giving blood tests. Frightened that these were mafia killers coming for his soul, at first he tried to resist. But as soon as he realized that these were law enforcement representatives, he immediately calmed down, surrendered, and even complimented the police on their excellent work. For several days he remained silent, smoking as usual, 3 packs of Marlboro a day, and then, in his terrible hoarse voice of a thoroughly smoked smoker, he began to speak. He was charged with only 8 episodes. He described in detail all 17, including the very first, which wasn't even considered criminal. But he refused to appear in court personally. Either he was afraid to look into the eyes of the relatives of the deceased, or he didn't want to participate in a tournament he was sure to lose. For all the lives he took, Donato Bilancia was sentenced to 13 life terms, plus 16 years for the attempted murder of Lorena. For the first 3 years he was obliged to be in isolation. Serial killers are generally very special people, but even among them, the Ligurian monster stands out. He wasn't a sadist, he didn't like watching people suffer, and he was simply afraid of the sight of blood. There was no sexual underlying motive in his crimes. Even when he had sex with his victims, it wasn't part of the murder scenario. He was truly interested only in the feeling of power and control. All he wanted was power over the world that had treated him so cruelly, and revenge on it. Until the age of 47, Bilancia hadn't hurt a fly, and who knows how his fate would have turned out if he hadn't overheard the conversation of friends who turned out to be traitors. He talked about himself, saying that it was as if two different people lived inside him, and at some point one took over the other. That he wanted to kill himself but lacked the courage. That when he got angry his head seemed to be encircled by a red-hot hoop. Quite a version for simulating a mental disorder. He underwent 13 psychiatric evaluations. All the conclusions were very profound, but unfortunately not very clear in answering the question of why he started killing. Because inside himself he was already dead, one of such answers. However, it doesn't matter. All examinations unanimously recognized Donato Bilancia as sane, and he went to serve his endless sentence. Donato Bilancia's fate in confinement is also not quite usual. At first, admittedly, like most serial killers, he continued to nurture his narcissism. He wrote a letter to the Pope asking for a blessing. He offered a famous journalist to interview him. He asked one of the most sought-after and expensive lawyers to defend him for a candy. The lawyer, by the way, initially agreed, but at a certain stage of the process realized that the cooperation wasn't working out, refused to work, and returned the payment. Naturally, the position of an inmate with such a record wasn't the best. Moreover, Bilancia, who ran as a lone wolf in freedom, remained one in prison. But after 10 years of imprisonment, something began to change in the black soul of the lone monster. He took up education, he learned foreign languages. In 2016, after defending his accountant diploma, he entered university specializing in cultural tourism management. He attended Mass, participated in theatrical productions together with other inmates, gradually opening up. He engaged in vocal training. Unfortunately, recordings where Bilancia sings Ave Maria with his beast-like growling voice haven't been preserved. But the main thing, he helps others. Every month he sends money from his pension to orphans, and to a woman from Sicily who is raising 3 disabled children alone. And he helps not only with money, he writes letters to his wards in which he tries to give them the human warmth they so lack. No one will ever know how sincere the Ligurian monster was in his repentance. Most psychiatrists believe that people like him don't change, and the prior of a nearby men's monastery, with whom Bilancia communicated personally and in letters, believes that Donato sincerely wanted to restore the humanity he had violated, and return to God. After 22 years in prison, in December 2020, not living to see 70 years, Donato Bilancia died from complications of coronavirus. He refused treatment. Shortly before his death, his ward from Sicily also ended up in intensive care. The repentant sinner turned to the Almighty with a prayer to take him, preserving the life of the unfortunate woman. Here it would be very nice to say that the exchange took place and the mother of 3 children survived, but unfortunately the outcome of this story is unknown. Once the former serial killer told the prison chaplain that he would undoubtedly go to hell, but before going there, he would like to ask God for just a few minutes to meet those he killed, and ask them for forgiveness. At his funeral, 17 chairs were placed around the coffin, each with a plaque bearing the name of one of his victims. Who knows if they forgave the Ligurian monster? Scientists are looking for an answer to the question, how does a person become a maniac? And the story of Donato Bilancia, who never showed inclinations towards violence until mature age, and then suddenly seemed to break loose and in just 6 months beat the country's record for the speed of destroying human lives, doesn't make this task any easier. One of the psychiatrists solved this paradox like this. Donato Bilancia is the embodiment of the simple and terrible fact that absolutely any of us can kill. It's enough just to start. Once upon a time, in Italy.